For 15 million years, the Arctic Ocean has been in the grip of ice, deeply frozen, barren as a desert. For thousands of years, people have adapted and thrived on the ice. Now, these people feel a threat.
We are moving in the direction of connecting climate change with human rights. It's a human issue.
The 21st century will see a transformation of the Arctic Ocean.
About a degree warmer than yesterday.
By the end of the century, the ice will be pretty close to gone.
There will be a rush for shipping shortcuts across the pole.
Companies are looking at the North and saying, when can we go?
A rush for oil and gas.
1/4 of the remaining resources in the world are estimated to be in the Arctic area.
And a rush to lay claim to a new ocean in the last great grab for territory in human history.
What's the cost? We really don't know all of the effects.
The world's most powerful nations are propelling the planet into an Arctic rush.
Directly in front of us, there's also a big humpback.
Oh, see, look.
Your chance of seeing orcas is right now. There they are. That's a fin whale. This is a whale-rama here. There's so many whales out here, I can't even keep track who's who. Boy, nice humpback. Fluke up dive, watch out. Big tail shot. Beautiful tail shot.
Alaska is special among American states. Its spectacular landscapes lure tourists to mingle with the wildlife and to marvel at the ice.
Watch. It's hard not to get excited about coming out when there's such a wide variety and seeing how excited people are.
At Kenai Fjords National Park, daily boat tours take tourists to the glaciers, pausing to watch masses of ice break off into the fjord.
More pieces coming down. Keep watching that area. Big crack has developed across the face.
Huge pieces of ice fall naturally from a glacier as it moves downhill. But at other glaciers at Kenai Fjords, global warming is taking its toll.
Thanks, folks. If I could get you to come back into science, that'd be great. Even with the global warming going on, one thing that causes is increased precipitation, which here falls as snow primarily. But all these red areas down low, you're getting a rapid ice loss down here where it's warmer.
Okay.
So.
Park Ranger Mike Tetro has been monitoring the glaciers at Kenai Fjords since the 1980s.
2002, it actually lost 100 yards in 2002, just during that summer. Well, glaciers actually can be a very good indicator of changing climate for sure, especially lower elevation, lower latitude glaciers are going to respond pretty dramatically to changes in climate.
The so-called exit glacier is the star attraction at Kenai Fjords because it's the only glacier reachable by car. And even though the glacier has been retreating since the 19th century, Tetro worries about how thin it is getting and how fast it is retreating.
Within our time frame, even within the last decade, you can see dramatic changes. I mean, that's the interesting thing about what's going on. It's right in front of your face. It's not a geologic timescale issue right now. It's now.
People will come and go that this is a trip of the lifetime, and they're the first to realize that it's an ever-changing environment where it may not be here.
Never seen anything like this. It's amazing. You'd like to bring your kids here someday, right, to see this? We hope it's around.
What is happening in southern Alaska is magnified the further north you go. People who live and hunt on the ice in the Arctic region, the Sami people of northern Europe, and the Inuit of Alaska, Russia, Greenland, and Canada all have tales to tell.
I learned from my father how to hunt.
Since he was a youngster, Pitsiolak Alanga has been hunting on the ice outside of Iqaluit, the capital of Canada's semi-autonomous Inuit territory of Nunavut.
In the springtime, what I have noticed from years back to today, the ice formation and the strength of the ice is different.
The Inuit know their ice, the indigenous peoples of North America, originally called Eskimos by Arctic explorers, have long adapted to the harsh Arctic climate.
Even though we've come to become wage earners, you know, working 9 to 5 and during the week, we are still avid hunters and fishermen. Our environment is our supermarket.
Inuit leader Sheila Watt-Cloutier says that the people of the high north are among the first to feel the effects of global warming. But she warns that as the Arctic warms up, the rest of us will eventually feel it too.
We are seeing and witnessing the melting of this planet faster than anybody else because we are on that ice and snow every day.
It's remarkable when a society like the Inuit in northern Canada develop a word for sunburn. They never had a word for that before.
The Inuit tribes have had a language, a spoken language, for 10,000 years. They never had the word robin in their language. Now they have robins flying around their villages.
But there may not be adequate words in any language to describe what may ultimately happen in the Arctic. Scientific predictions are forcing people to imagine a North Pole without ice.
You'd have to go back 15 million years to find the last time the Arctic Ocean was routinely free of sea ice.
Leading polar scientists say that the next 100 years will see an unprecedented melt.
First, it is really happening now and has been happening seriously for the last 30 years. We have places in the Arctic that are warming 5 to 10 times the rate of the rest of the planet, and that will continue.
In the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, some 300 of the world's top Arctic scientists from 8 countries analyzed computer models of climate and Arctic sea ice. Their forecast shows that the polar ice cap will melt away during the summers as the planet warms.
Our models project that there's anywhere from a complete emptying of ice by the mid-century to maybe that happening by the end of the century, depending on which model you look at. So a conservative estimate is that by the end of the century, in the summer, which is immediately mid-September, the ice will be pretty close to gone in the Arctic basin. And that's a gigantic change of anything we've ever anticipated.
All of our history has been framed by a planet as we've gotten to know this planet that has a white pole on each end. One of the fundamental features of the Earth, visible from space, could be changed. It could be routine to have a world, planet Earth, that in summer is blue, open water waves on the top and white on the bottom.
The predicted melt means a new ocean will emerge. And while some warn of environmental catastrophe, others are calculating the benefits of open Arctic waters.
As long as it's ice, nobody cares, except us, because we hunt and fish and travel on that ice. That's our homeland. However, the minute it starts to thaw and becomes water, then the whole world is interested. They may see it as a benefit. For us, we would probably see it as one of the biggest intrusions into our homeland.
In the push to the north, there will be winners and losers. The resources in the region might be worth trillions of dollars, and with more open waters, shipping routes will blossom. The long-held and mythic dream for a shortcut across the top of the globe will come true.
Well, if there's any good news, the long-sought Northwest Passage will now become a reality. Those of us who study history remember that was the dream for a trade route to China that was held by our maritime nations for years.
The pursuit of the Northwest Passage is part of the fabled lore of the North. Spellbound explorers became icebound as they tried to conquer the frozen channels. Many met an icy death. But tales of the treacherous passage could eventually be the stuff of history books.
I looked at all the old books about what things used to be like, and it was a horror show. Everyone died, everyone froze to death. It took anyone wanting to go that way got stuck on the ice at least for 1 or 2 winters before they could even think about getting through the Northwest Passage. And the idea of it being open water, it really has been a dream of civilizations for a long time.
And the idea of opening up the ocean has many different facets. There are pros to it, there are cons to it. It's a complicated thing. If you're a shipping company and you want to take, product from Europe to Asia, you'd really like to see the Northwest Passage navigable even for a few months a year. Because, of course, the middle part of the planet's the fat part. The top ends are the skinny part. So you can get over the northern hemisphere much more quickly, which means at much less of a cost.
Today, ships travel from Asia to Europe through the Panama Canal. Sailing the Northwest Passage through the Canadian archipelago would trim thousands of miles off the trip.
Companies are looking at the north and saying, okay, when can we go? When is the risk of going through the north sufficiently low?
On the problem side, you don't know what goes on with disasters from ships, natural hazards, you have increased storminess. So all of these things complicate this. It's not just a straightforward answer.
To look for answers, Arctic expert David Barber is leading a team of researchers in Churchill, Manitoba, on a series of studies of the ice in Hudson Bay. What they find may help this town and its port get a leg up in the Arctic rush. Churchill, Manitoba on Canada's Hudson Bay has dreamed of being a viable port since the 1920s. But the port remains icebound for 8 months a year, its tugboats and silos dormant.
This has been a dream in Manitoba for a century, really. The initial ideas for the port were around the turn of the century, and we're now into the next century, and it's kind of now starting to look like a realistic proposition.
A railroad company called Omnitracks has plans that could turn Churchill into a boom town. The company has made a $50 million investment in order to be first out of the gate in the race for Arctic shipping routes. They're calling it an Arctic Bridge, a route from Murmansk, Russia to Churchill. From Churchill, goods can travel by rail as far as Monterrey, Mexico. To make this happen, Omnitracks is counting on a little help from the climate.
Here in Churchill, we work very closely with the Omnitracks people who own the port of Churchill, and they're very interested in what's going on with sea ice in Hudson Bay.
So what are we up to here, boys? Temperature course. Ice surface, it's about minus 4.5, and then it's getting warmer towards the bottom.
As the spring begins to thaw the ice near Churchill, Professor David Barber leads a team of researchers on the sea ice in Hudson Bay.
I was just looking around, you can see where the ponds are going to start to form, eh?
Well, yeah, today it's been melting very fast. So.
What we're doing on the sea ice is we're studying how the physical system is changing in the ocean ice atmosphere environment in this area.
Barber is one of Canada's leading polar scientists. He says what's good for shipping isn't necessarily good for the environment.
So here comes the core, hopefully. The sea ice season is getting shorter each year, and because it's shorter, the oceans can absorb more solar radiation. It warms the surface of the ocean up, takes it longer to freeze the next fall. So we're becoming very concerned about climate change in the high latitudes because you can see it happening in front of you.
It's about a degree warmer than yesterday.
The climate change that we're seeing is happening very rapidly. We haven't really prepared for this. We don't really know what some of these answers to these questions are. We're not even sure what some of the questions are.
As the sea ice season shortens here, some believe the so-called Arctic Bridge could be viable in less than a generation.
I think some of that's going to open up on timescales of the next decades or a few decades. It's not a century sort of issue from what we can see. Hudson Bay is opening up really rapidly already. You can see this from our satellite images.
Churchill Mayor Mike Spence worries that even though more ice-free months may bring more ships to town, it can also hurt the town's biggest moneymaker, tourism. Churchill is most famous for polar bears. The bears come through town each year as they migrate to their northern hunting grounds on the Hudson Bay ice.
Churchill is well known for the polar bear capital of the world.
Look at the snowshoes on his rear paws there. Look at the size of those.
But polar bears need ice to survive.
If you extend the period where Hudson Bay is ice-free, you put increased stress on the polar bears, and at a certain point, the polar bears starve. And Hudson Bay no longer has polar bears.
Will the bears adapt to it? We hope they can, because it'll be pretty hard for us to adapt without the bears.
At the other end of the proposed Arctic bridge, the port city of Murmansk, 3,700 miles from Churchill, tells another side of the tale. As countries sharpen their elbows to stake out dominance in the Arctic, Russia's long shipping history puts it in a strong position. Russia also has its own Arctic shipping lane, a rival to the Northwest Passage, called the Northern Sea Route. In the Soviet era, the country built nuclear-powered icebreakers to open up the passage for shipping. The route connects Asia to Europe across the north of Siberia.
In the Soviet time, there was a system. There were special aircraft that flew 24 hours a day and would recommend a route for the icebreakers, because the icebreakers were followed by other transport boats. And it all collapsed with the end of the Soviet Union.
The Murmansk Shipping Company still operates the nuclear icebreakers. The ships plow through the Northern Sea Route during the 4 months when the ice is thinnest. Researchers predict the route will open up to more shipping sooner and faster than the Northwest Passage over North America. This will give Russia a head start over Canada.
The place where the ice is receding most rapidly is along the coastal margins of the Russian, what we call the Northern Sea Route. And we're down to the point where there's only one little choke point left, where we'll start opening this up instead of 2 or 3 weeks a year, 2 or 3 months a year, and then onwards up to maybe as much as 6 months a year, where that pathway will be open.
It'll be wonderful, like the Suez Canal.
We're not quite there yet, but as the ice melts, we're going to be there in the next 5 or 10 years. And so some companies are already building the ice-strengthened freighters and tankers, super tankers, to make that passage.
Across the Arctic Ocean from Russia, Canada knows that new ocean waters could mean increased threats to its borders. The Canadian Forces Northern Area launches its annual exercises in the Arctic. But Canadian forces are not prepared for all the activity an open Arctic Ocean would bring.
There are a lot of, I would say, security concerns, security issues, or contingencies that we have to be ready for. These are brought on by the increased accessibility of the Arctic.
Rangers, go, arm!
Canada maintains a reserve force of rangers in the Arctic, and many of them are Inuit natives. The rangers do regular sovereignty patrols. They put boot prints in the snow to maintain Canada's claim on its far northern territories. But an open Northwest Passage could lead to international disputes. There are countries, including the United States, that consider the passage to be international waters.
Some countries take the view that they have the right to treat the passage as an international strait, which means that Canada could impose almost no restrictions on shipping through the strait.
Look at the top of the globe and you see how many of the world's most powerful countries are remarkably close to one another. Arctic nations are girding themselves for a fight over every inch of ocean territory. Turf battles over the Arctic will be handled through a treaty called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
The Convention on Law of the Sea was to try to pull nations together to see if we couldn't set up a system, a structure, that would make some sense to govern the oceans of the world as a human resource that we all need desperately.
Under the treaty, nations can claim the ocean bottom beyond their 200-mile exclusive economic zones.
The Arctic is potentially very, very resource rich, and so there's been a tremendous amount of interest in countries mapping the Arctic so that they can make a claim for an extended continental shelf, as it's called in the treaty.
To stake their claims, countries will need to show how their continental shelves extend into the sea, and they'll need better mapping to do it.
It's one thing to melt the ice. It's another thing to have seaways. There's a lot of places where we haven't mapped the seafloor, so we don't know if there's shoals in there that could, rip the belly out of a ship real fast.
Here's where Arctic countries currently stand. Canada has potential claims on a huge area to its north. America can petition for a swath of ocean as large as the continental United States. Denmark, which oversees Greenland, could claim the North Pole because its shelf connects to an undersea mountain range. And Russia has submitted a claim covering half of the Arctic Ocean. It's not much different from the arbitrary lines that Joseph Stalin once drew.
Сталин нарисовал, вот так взял от Мурманска до Северного полюса.
Stalin once just drew a line from Murmansk to the North Pole and then to Chukchi and said USSR Polar Region. And nobody was worried about it. But today, when the gas and oil fields were found on the shelf, of course it has become a very important issue. And we shall, of course, follow all the conventions and the laws of the sea.
Russia was first out of the block and under the law of the sea, staking a claim, making its case for virtually half of the Arctic Ocean, right up to the North Pole. And the Commission basically said, we don't think you have enough data to support your claim. So they've sent back to redo their homework.
The clock is ticking. Countries have only 10 years after ratifying the treaty to map the sea floor and make their claims. But critics say the world's only superpower could be left out of the discussions as nations divvy up the ocean floor. That's because the United States Senate has yet to ratify the treaty.
We need to be in the game at the table talking about fisheries management, mineral extraction, freedom of navigation. That's why these bodies that are set up within the Law of the Sea Convention are essential to have membership from the United States.
At stake for the United States, $1.5 trillion in resources, according to one estimate. And the rush for territory is being driven in great part by a thirst for oil and gas.
An incredible irony in all of this. The rush to extract petroleum in the north is facilitated by the ice melting. And the ice is melting, at least in part, because of the consumption of fossil fuels.
For decades, an international program of oceanographers has been going around the world drilling cylinders out of seabeds because it's essentially a textbook. It's a history book of what conditions were like in the ocean above in centuries and millenniums and even millions of years past. But the Arctic, it's never been done because it's a sea that's covered with ice most of the time. There are very few ships that are able to go through that ice. And finally, over this past year, again, driven partially by the idea that global warming is creating big changes in the Arctic, but we don't know how to put them in context. Historically, people finally got up the budget to pull together an expedition to go north. There was 3 icebreakers, one of which was equipped with a big 90-foot tall drilling rig that was going to drill holes in the seabed. But how do you do that on an ocean that's covered with ice? Well, you have to have the other 2 ships along, essentially to run interference. The ice up there is not just sitting still, it's all moving all the time. When I was at the North Pole a couple of years ago, the ice we were standing on was moving 400 yards an hour. And it's sort of like standing on a big turntable, a giant turntable the size of the United States. So they're faced with the idea of staying in one position long enough to drill into the seabed, perhaps 1,000 meters. But the ice is kind of coming at them like a relentless freight train. So the other ships ran interference, and they stayed upstream in that ice stream and kind of broke it up enough so that the one ship could drill. And it took, it was 2 or 3 weeks of effort, and they finally came back with what sounds so inconsequential, 400 meters, about 1,200 feet of vertical depth of a core that they pulled from the ocean bed. But it turns out that they got a good record of about 55 million years of Arctic climate history by doing that. In these layers that they looked at, going back through time, you have various things you look at for evidence of what conditions were like in the old days. There's pebbles that dropped from the sea ice. They were sea ice scrapes along the shores of the Arctic Ocean, and dirt gets onto it, and then it goes out of the middle and melts, and that you get a rain of pebbles that end up in the sea. And that tells you, oh, well, for that depth of sediment at that age, there was sea ice, because there's no way those pebbles got there elsewhere. One of the other things they started finding is these layers of dark stuff, black mud that could only be the result of organic material, meaning plant life, essentially, that had fallen to the floor of the sea. 49 million years ago, there's this layer, this really thick layer of this organic stuff that has spores from a plant called azolla. It's a fern. So there was a point 49 million years ago when there were ferns growing on the Arctic Ocean. It's like duckweed on a pond. It's a cousin of duckweed. And this was on top of a mountain, an underwater mountain. They drilled this hole in the top of an underwater mountain because it's kind of a compressed, it gives you sort of it's like the chapters of the book instead of the whole thousands and thousands of years of book, because that steady rain of sediment you get in the ocean for millions of years. The top of a ridge like that just catches a sample of it. So they did find, though, that there's these layers that are very thick when it was organic. And to the scientists on board that ship, several of them, they said, well, if you have that much organic stuff up on top of that underwater mountain, just think how much is down on the seabed, the floor of the deep, 2-mile deep sea floor of the Arctic Ocean. And those are the people who are saying this is a very good sign, well, a strong sign, whether it's good or bad depends on your interpretation, of that there could be oil there, because if you have all that organic stuff, it's been there for tens of millions of years, other rock lays down on top of it, you build a pressure cooker, and that can create oil. Some of the scientists on the ship were reluctant to talk about this aspect of their research. They were very excited about the idea of what the ancient climate might have been like, and that there was a time when it was free of ice or not. But when it got to the implications for oil, the last thing many of these people on the ship wanted to convey to the public was that the opening of the Arctic was going to expose new potential oil resources to be exploited, burned, and add to global warming.
It's the tail end of the cod fishing season in Norway's Lofoten Islands, and Børge Iversen and his son set out from the village to check their nets.
This village called Balstad, it's a typical fisherman's village. And it lives about 1,000 people here. And we have a lot of fishermen who live only off fishing.
Even though Lofoten is above the Arctic Circle, the ocean here is warmed by the Gulf Stream and never freezes. During the winter months, when the codfish come from further north to spawn, this area becomes one of the world's most productive cod fisheries.
The area here in Lofoten is the largest spawning area in the world for cod. And not only the cod, we have the herring too.
Børge knows that global warming can have profound effects on fish. Scientists have already measured big shifts in fish stocks related to changing sea ice and temperature patterns. This could be a boon to some fishing communities and a disaster for others.
We are worried about that. That could change the route for the cod. If the water will be hotter here, then the cod will not come.
But Børge says his biggest fear comes from Norway's #1 moneymaker, oil and gas. His nightmare is a wreck like the Exxon Valdez that spilled nearly 11 million gallons of oil in Alaska.
We are worried about the oil industry. We don't like that to come in this area. We want to have Lofoten petroleum free.
As the price of oil goes up, and with current reserves running thin, countries and oil companies are pushing northward. Norway is already the world's 3rd largest oil exporter behind Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it's poised to lead the frigid march for Arctic oil and gas.
The withdrawal of the polar ice cap could have some very adverse circumstances. People are worried about that, but in the terms we're talking about, obviously, it would make exploration production somewhat easier.
We do see that there's a huge potential regarding petroleum in the Arctic area in the future. The U.S. Geological Survey has estimated that 1/4 of the remaining resources in the world are estimated to be in the Arctic area.
All of the major U.S. companies and some of the smaller ones are active in the Norwegian continental shelf, exploring for and producing oil and gas. And Norway's importance to the U.S. in terms of our national energy policy is increasing with every passing year as they become a larger and larger factor in meeting our deficit supply of petroleum, but more particularly natural gas.
Norway is betting $7.5 billion that this new natural gas facility will be a model for future Arctic prosperity. Statoil, Norway's top oil and gas company, is building a huge processing plant near Hammerfest, the country's northernmost town. An underwater pipeline will pump the gas from 90 miles offshore. The plant will then liquefy the gas for export. The gas field is called Snøhvit, Norwegian for Snow White.
This is the first time we will try to sell our gas produced on the Norwegian continental shelf to US and continue to be a main supplier for oil and gas to Europe.
Snøhvit is the first of a massive new wave of gas production in Arctic waters. The Norwegians are also exploring for oil in the region. And east of here, in Russian waters, another major gas field called Stokman is ready for production. As this rush for hydrocarbons speeds up, Norway finds itself challenged to balance its quest for wealth with its strong environmental ethic.
What is important for us and should hear the most of the people in the world is, of course, that when we move into new frontier areas, we should be sure that we do that in a sustainable manner, that we are taking care of the area, that we should try to develop it so that it will not cause any problems in the future.
Norway is a very rich place because it has so much oil, and the minister recognizes that, the government recognizes that, and they're aggressively seeking to take the lead in forming policy in the Barents and the Arctic region. They have the opinion that Russia is going to develop their areas in the Arctic regardless of what anyone thinks, and it would be better if Norway had some sort of influence in helping to guide that development because it has an environmentally safe record when it comes to doing those things.
When Norway looks east to neighboring Russia, the environmental contrasts are striking. Russia has long mined and drilled its Arctic regions to fuel its economy. Soviet-era technology still plagues the environment here. For the struggling Russian Federation, oil and gas are key to economic survival. Russian oil production in the Arctic has already increased much faster than analysts expected.
In Murmansk Oblast, we were expecting oil transport up to 10 million tons per year, and it was supposed to increase over next 10 years up to 20 million. It's 20 million this year.
The environmental concerns don't all relate to drilling. They relate to transshipment as well. And the Norwegians are extremely sensitive because the sea lanes leaving the Barents Sea really take them right through the middle of Norway's economic zone in the sea.
There's a good amount of dissension in Norway when it comes to developing the country's energy resources in the Arctic. Here in the Lofoten Islands, for example, one of the most dramatically beautiful parts of the country, the economy has for centuries depended on fishing, cod fishing. This is the largest cod spawning area in the world, and people here are very much aware of that. They're already watching with some concern the activity of Russian oil tankers that are leaving the port of Murmansk in the Barents Sea and passing through their waters on their way to markets in Europe.
Maritime law allows huge oil tankers to come up to a dozen miles off the Norwegian coast. And most of these ships don't have double hulls, which prevents spills when tankers run aground.
We see ships every day. Russian ships take the oils through the area here. We want them to go outside the coast, but they don't want to listen to that. If there is an accident, it will take a lot of years to repair the nature.
We have only 2 coastal bases for oil spill combat equipment, one in Kandalaksha and one in Murmansk. In Norway, they have at least 50 bases of this kind, so I think that our preparedness is inadequate.
When considering an oil spill in the cold north, images of the wreck of the Exxon Valdez immediately come to mind. But Prince William Sound is well below the Arctic Circle.
The Exxon Valdez caused huge environmental damage along the coast of Alaska. But that ecosystem on the coast of Alaska was a lot more resilient than the ecosystem in the Arctic would be. The ecosystems up here, they're extraordinarily fragile. They're only a couple months each year when they're not frozen solid.
Scientists I've talked to, both in the academic world and at the Coast Guard, who deal with oil spills all the time, say there is no protocol for dealing with an oil spill in Arctic icy waters.
And so the recovery period is stretched over decades or centuries if there's any kind of damage of that sort. If you drive an ATV across the tundra, the marks from that single transit will be there for a century. This is an incredibly fragile environment.
Three-quarters of the Russian town of Vorkuta is built on permafrost, icy soil that stays frozen year-round. So long ago, they had to learn how to build on top of permafrost without melting it. That's why most of this Arctic city's structures are built on pylons. The stilts elevate the buildings to keep the heating systems from warming the soil below.
What used to be the basement is now on the first floor.
Vorkuta Mayor Igor Spektor used to be in the construction business. Now he runs this struggling coal mining city. Vorkuta began as one of Joseph Stalin's infamous Gulag towns, where forced labor camps provided raw materials to the Soviet state. In post-Soviet Russia, much of the population of Vorkuta has moved away, and many of its buildings are crumbling.
Our windows are falling apart. We repair it. It lasts one winter and we have to repair it again.
This is just a pipe drilled to bottom of the cooling systems, and they can measure the temperature at that level.
Some buildings here are modified with radiators to funnel sub-zero ammonia beneath their foundations. That helps keep the ground frozen. If the permafrost melts, the building can sink.
So these cracks show that after the initial repair, the cracks reappeared, and it indicates that the building is still moving.
In spite of these efforts, some 80% of Vorkuta's buildings are considered dangerous, according to the studies cited in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. On Madcap Lane in Fairbanks, Alaska, residents have similar complaints about permafrost damage. Permafrost melt throughout Alaska is buckling foundations, knocking over utility poles, and heaving highway pavement into gnarled bumps. As the push to open the Arctic rushes forward, pictures like these show the potential consequences of climate change.
Infrastructure like roads and pipelines, which span literally hundreds of miles and have to contend with permafrost in one way or another, are going to be at risk.
A warmer Arctic means permafrost is no longer permanent.
The computer model for climate projections predict that the freezing line will move northward by several hundred miles by the end of the century. There's a lot of real estate that would be affected by a move northwards by several hundred miles.
And Fairbanks and Vorkuta are both in the danger zone as the freezing line moves further north. But Mayor Spector says Vorkuta is not crumbling because of global warming.
It's bad maintenance. It's faulty construction.
And Spector joins other Russians who are skeptical of the findings of Western climate scientists. He believes the recent warming is just a natural climate cycle, and that Vorkuta will be as cold as ever in the decades to come.
We're not going to have apple trees growing in Vorkuta.
The sentiment seems to be a party line in Russia. Even some of the top scientists from the country's Arctic and Antarctic Institute say climatologists in the West are working with faulty data.
We question the scenarios on basis of which the forecasts are made.
Of course, when you say there's going to be warming and you scare people, it's a lot easier to get financing grants.
In Russia, there's been a lot of resistance to the idea that there could be a human forced change in climate that would matter. Perhaps because the Russians have endured climate extremes for so long that they feel, nature is pretty rough and tough without our help.
The views of these skeptical Russian scientists run counter to the overwhelming majority of polar researchers, who believe not only that global warming is real, but also that it is anthropogenic or human-caused.
I belong to the group of people who think that it is very difficult to explain the observed global and Arctic warming only by natural variability.
At a recent meeting we had in Reykjavik, we had maybe 400 or 500 scientists in a room, and they asked me the question. I said, there's not 5 people in this room who would doubt that climate change is occurring and that it's anthropogenic. It is that strong a consensus in the scientific community.
That consensus seems to be changing the stance of U.S. President George Bush. In July 2005, he acknowledged for the first time that humans are contributing to global warming.
Let's not recognize that the surface of the Earth is warmer and that an increase in greenhouse gases caused by humans is contributing to the problem.
In spite of their skepticism, officials in Vorkuta concede that if temperatures rise too much, many buildings will collapse.
Yes, for those buildings built on the permafrost, you can expect very serious damage.
In my opinion, it's not going to happen.
In the Sami region of northern Norway, near the town of Kautokeino, winter is coming to an end.
The Samis are indigenous people, and our living is very close to the nature. Fishing, reindeer herding, it's in our blood, the culture and the reindeers.
Reindeer herder Marit and her uncle Isak prepared to move their herds from the central hills to the coast, where the animals graze in summer. Throughout the winter, the reindeer survive on lichen that grows under the snow. This could be why the Sami language contains dozens of words for snow.
Snow is really the Achilles heel of reindeer herding, because the reindeer have this incredible capacity to work their way through the snow to get the good lichen versus the bad lichen.
The caribou and the muskox need to be able to dig through the snow to get to the vegetation that's buried underneath. And if it rains in the winter, you get a layer of ice on top of the snow that prevents them from being able to get to the vegetation. And so they could well starve.
This winter we had a very snowy winter. And it's not so good for the reindeers. As you can see here, over here, the reindeers have been here digging after the food, the yagil. Yagil needs the light to grow and water. The autumns, they are more warmer than in old times. And then they get ice on the ground and more snow, and that can be very difficult for the reindeers.
The environment is the base for the Sami culture, for the traditional culture. And even though people live in the modern time and they have adapted to this time, they still have some kind of a relationship to the traditional way of living. And with that connection, you are very concerned. How will the pollution and climate change affect to the Sami traditional livelihoods?
Oh, you're lucky bringing smoked reindeer meat.
The people who are making the decisions, they're living in the south, and they're living in towns. They don't mark the change of weather. It's only people who live in nature and get resources from nature who mark the changes. I hope that they are listening to nature and what nature is showing them.
Given their sparse populations, it's no wonder many people who live in the Arctic, including the Samis and the Inuit, say they feel outnumbered and overpowered.
We're 155,000 Inuit in the entire world.
To think that in this stage of the Arctic Council, we're still fighting our way into being part of these issues is just appalling.
The Inuit have decided to take their issues to the world's most powerful leaders. Because its people have been witnessing many changes in the environment, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference is challenging the United States over greenhouse gas emissions.
They're saying, we're very concerned, our world is turned upside down, ice isn't behaving the way it used to. Culturally, our backs are already to the wall. And now you guys, by pumping out all these greenhouse gases, are kind of pushing us over the edge. And they were planning to go to an Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and actually challenge the United States in international court, essentially, for violating their human rights. My perception is this is the first time it's been really cast as a human issue.
This is the survival, the cultural survival of a people, of an entire people, that is at stake here. And we are fighting very hard to keep that intact.
As another winter cod fishing season ends in Norway's Lofoten Islands, fisherman Børge Iversen considers his autumn years.
I've been fishing here 15 years. 30, 40 years ago, it was 25,000 men who lives of the fish here in Lofoten. Today, it's only 3,500.
You can smell that the winter is over now.
Børge worries that the country's angling for Arctic dominance could leave fishermen like him behind. He hopes the changes in the Arctic won't keep him from passing on his livelihood to his 28-year-old son.
Yes, he is very happy to be a fisherman. And I am happy to have him with me. And I hope that he will continue with the fishing. When I am being so old, I can go back back home, he can take over and use the same as I have done the last 30 years.
Scientists warn that not all of the anticipated impacts of Arctic warming will be local. The Arctic Ocean plays a crucial role in climate systems that ultimately affect the entire globe.
The Arctic is the engine that drives the conveyor belt of ocean waters. It drives the climate of the world. Let's come together on this and understand the Arctic, because if we don't, we'll never understand climate in the world.
There'll be close to a meter sea level rise during this century. And you know, meter doesn't sound like a lot, but if you live in Bangladesh, that's 60% of the country. If you live in southern Florida, it's gone. The Keys are underwater.
All of global warming has nothing to do with the planet at all. We're just going to warm the place up. The planet will go on through its normal cycles and it'll do its own thing. It only has to do with us as people. And our economic side of things and our political side of things are really what are being affected by climate change. The planet could care less.
What's the cost? The cost is the destruction of the ecosystem in the Arctic. The cost is the melting of the ice caps, which is going to have profound effects throughout the globe. We really don't know all of the effects of this wrenching change in the ecosystem of the Earth.
The Arctic is the early warning for the world. And what we're trying to say is, what is happening to us now, it's only a matter of time. The rest of the world will be that negatively impacted as well.
Whatever the final costs, one thing is crystal clear. We've set in motion changes that will mean the Arctic of our lore and imagination, a place of frozen vistas where few humans tread, is history.